Hi, welcome back. My name is Devraj, and today I'm going to be looking at Liber Al. Liber Al Vel Legis, otherwise known as the Book of the Law, is a brief work channeled by the English esotericist Aleister Crowley back in 1904. In fact, whilst he was on holiday, actually on honeymoon with his new wife in Cairo, Egypt. I'm not going to go into a long history about the book or Crowley, in fact, partly because Crowley simply channeled this work and then basically discarded it for a long period of time, and then at the behest of some kind of internal prompting, after some decades, did publish it in its original format. And also because I'm not a Crowley expert or an expert on history, and if you're interested in the history of Crowley and this book, I really recommend you read this paper. Came out last year, 2025, by Alan Chapman. It's called "Is a God to Live in a Dog?" That's a line from the Book of the Law, the Liber Al. And Alan is really, I think, an expert on Crowley, and he's done an amazing job in really digging into his life. And this is a great paper that you can find free online if you put that into Google. Likewise, if you want to find the full text for the Liber Al, you can go to the OTO website and look for it there. And the exciting thing about this version here is that once you go past the sort of preamble to the actual book, which starts here, you see on the right-hand side these numbers, which when you click on one, it shows you the original, it's a photo of the original writing that Crowley did back in 1904. Today, we're just going to be looking at the opening 5 or so lines of Liber Al. But before we do that, I want to just really speak a little bit about this book. Essentially, this book is a kind of prophecy, or maybe it's even kind of acting on your consciousness to bring something about to do with the new Aeon, which is a popular topic for me at the moment. I think it was Plato or sometime around that era of the kind of, back 400 BC or something, when people started to come up with this concept of the new Aeon, and that every 2,100 years or so, a new astrological sign became dominant in human culture. And that for the last 2,000 years, we've been in the Piscean era, and now we're moving into the Aquarian era. And that this will, engender quite large-scale changes in society, and also on a deeper level, changes in human subjectivity, changes in what it is to be a person. And this book, in some ways, it's a kind of reset program. It's actually kind of trying to take your consciousness back to a very primal state and allow this new subjective state to emerge. There are 3 basic characters, 2 of whom we see even in the first line. One of the main character in the chapter 1 is Nuit, or Nu, and she is the star goddess. We'll have a look at her in a moment. And then Hadit, Had, is really like a point of awareness that experiences the star goddess. And the star goddess really is the sum of creation, in a sense. And then in chapter 3, we meet Horus, who is like the child, the new regenerated form of consciousness that is born when you've gone back into this very primal space. These, as you're probably aware, are also Egyptian god names, so you can look at it on that level too. But essentially, it's talking about consciousness, it's talking about subjectivity, and it's trying to renew it for the new Aeon. The book is pretty controversial, and not only because Crowley was a controversial character, but because it is quite brutal, quite savage in places, particularly chapter 3 on Horus. Horus is most definitely in his terrible twos and, willing to really devastate all existing structures and religions from the Piscean era. Let's take a look at the text. Had, the manifestation of Nuit. So Nuit, like I said, is the star goddess. Let's take a look at the star goddess as a tarot key. Find my star goddess. Hopefully YouTube don't ban me for having a picture of a naked woman on the stream. And essentially, the star goddess, she is a personification of the force behind the manifest world. Essentially, that's what she is. If you're at all familiar with like Immanuel Kant and Kantian philosophy, he had this concept of, that was back in the late 1700s, I believe, and he had this concept of noumena and phenomena. And the world we experience through our senses is the world of phenomena. And then behind that world, there is a world of noumena, which is like a kind of deep reality that we can't actually access. Our mind is processing noumena and creating the experience of phenomena. And that is personified here by this character of the star goddess. There's quite a lot of symbolism in this key. Quite a lot of it isn't really especially necessary or relevant to Liber Owl. The notable thing, she's got her foot in this slightly strange position resting on water. That's more to do with the capacity of certain meditative states to kind of fix energy and allow it to flow upwards and this kind of thing. But we don't need to go into that stuff here. It's not really relevant to Liber Owl. The other aspect that is a little bit relevant is these two pitchers of water that she's pouring out. So in her right hand, she's pouring out essentially subconsciousness. And what you notice is it flows as a stream, and when it hits the earth, in this case a pool, it starts to ripple outwards. It creates these little waves. And then in her left hand, curiously left hand for consciousness, is self-consciousness. She's pouring out this stream of self-consciousness. And when it hits the ground, it becomes 5 channels, which are one for each sense, basically: sight, touch, taste, etc. And one of these streams flows back into the pool. And I would say that's the sense of touch, the sense of feeling. Other people would say it's the sense of hearing. So essentially what this woman is doing, she's behind the scenes. She's the star goddess behind the scenes, and she's pouring out subconsciousness and self-consciousness. And then how it appears is that there's a me, that there's a Devaraj, a limited entity living inside this mind, experiencing this stuff. It seems as though this world that I see around me, that's my experience. And it seems as though the unconscious forces that flow through me in this wave-like motion, causing me to have different moods, and where all sorts of repressed stuff is going on. It seems like that's mine. But what this key is pointing to is that actually that is just for phenomena, that's just for surface appearance. And behind the scenes, it's this lady here, the star goddess, who is really running the show. But for the purposes of the Aeon that we're in, it seems like it's me doing it. And that's important for this era, to attach to these experiences. Something else very interesting about this key, it's not represented down here. By the way, I didn't mention this key is coming from the builders of the Adatum, who are an American esoteric group founded in the 1920s by a chap called Dr. Paul Foster Case. And they probably are the best for tarot. In fact, I think that's pretty clear. They really they go very extensively in their correspondence course into tarot, and the tarot they use is really the best, in my opinion, because it's very deeply anchored in esoteric concepts. So it's really an awesome tarot to get your hands on. You can find it online. Also, what's significant about this key, if you're familiar with astrology, is that the star is related to Aquarius, which is the era which we're coming into. Okay, let's put her to one side for a moment and move on with the text. The unveiling of the company of heaven. Interesting line to get straight away in a channeled work. What is the company of heaven? And they're getting unveiled. Well, the obvious kind of inference to me is it's some form of gods or supernal archetypes in some way, who, like Nuit, they're creating our experience. On a more light-hearted level, I once looked at this line and its numerology with a couple of the ciphers which have emerged from this book over the decades. Those are the English Kabbalah. You can look it up, an alphanumeric Kabbalah. And tried putting some big tech companies and AI companies in. And the company OpenAI does create, when you add it to this line, some quite interesting patterns. But that's really to the side. I don't think that's really relevant to the text or what I'm looking at today. I thought I'd just throw that in. Every man and every woman is a star. So this to me this is really coming out of this kind of Aquarian concept. Aquaries is as a human figure to it. It's a human water carrier, and Pisces is these two little fish. So this is really an assertion to me. What it's saying is, it is what it's saying. It's saying we are stars. You should go out there and shine in the world. Every number is infinite. There is no difference. So this nuit, this unbroken wholeness that is existing behind creation, in her natural state, there is no categorization by number. None of this stuff really exists, or has, rather, none of it has any meaning. That's what it's saying here. And now we come really to the line that is the nub of it for me. I love this line. Help me, O warrior lord of Thebes, in my unveiling before the children of men. So this is Nuit speaking. Now, who is she speaking to? She's speaking to not Hadit, the pinpoint of awareness that experiences Nuit, but rather the conglomeration of mental attitudes, the intellectual mind that has grown around Hadit. We start off in life like this pinpoint of awareness, and then slowly we kind of pick up a name and all sorts of ideas about the kind of person we are. We build up this notion of a limited me inside our mind. And that is represented well by the tarot key, the Emperor. Let's see if we can find the Emperor here. Make him a little bit bigger. So this is key 4, the Emperor, assigned to Aries, the first very fiery alpha kind of sign. Now let's look at the Emperor for a moment. This is a symbol really for the rational mind, but an intellect, but also on a deeper level, it is the force that creates the phenomenal world from the noumena. So it's this kind of interface between the star goddess and what we experience, and it's charged, it's a very protective character. That's one of its things. It's looking to the north. This direction here is symbolically north, and the north in esoterica is the direction of the unknown, of the outside, of all the stuff we don't know about, the mysteries. He's holding in his right hand Egyptian Ankh sign, or a modified Egyptian Ankh sign, which is a key to the underworld, gives you access to the underworld, the Egyptian underworld. And it's also a sign of life, a sign of the sun. It's kind of like a solar thing, kind of above the horizon here. In his left hand, he has this globe with a cross on it, so like a sign of dominion, traditionally. What's significant about this guy is he's wearing armor. He's got this armor, so he's defended. He's looking into the unknown, and if he sees something dodgy, he's going to kind of control it and stop it from interfering and damaging. What's here behind in the south, symbolically in the south. So the Emperor is this rational mind, this intellect, who's basically taking the star goddess and he's creating a kind of civilized version. It's like he's living in a jungle, and the intellectual mind is hacking out the jungle and creating like a garden, an area of garden within the jungle. And he needs to maintain that through his intellectual capacity, rationalizing things, making sense of it, putting it into an orderly kind of arrangement so that we can make sense of it and we can work with it and we can use it here in this Piscean era. Let's go back to the text. So what's happening is Nuit, the star goddess, is talking to this Emperor character, saying, help me, a warrior lord of Thebes. So she's kind of bigging him up a bit. She's accepting that he's the kind of, this warrior character who's protecting her, or what's really protecting the consciousness of the Piscean era. But she's also exhorting him to get on board with her mission. Help me, O warrior lord of Thebes, in my unveiling, another unveiling, before the children of men. So she wants, the consciousness of the Piscean era to experience her, to experience the star goddess, to experience, being essentially Hadit, the pinpoint of awareness rather than the rational self, and to experience, the amazingness of creation. And then when that happens, what's going to happen is the children of men is a reference to this regenerated consciousness assigned to Horus. So, it's quite a lot to unpack, but it's a very deep mystical vision. So she's really saying, help me, a warrior lord of Thebes, rational intellect, because I want to unveil myself. I want this Piscean consciousness, this me, to experience the sheer depth and the sheer revelatory aspect of my true being. I want to show him who I am. I want to show her who I am. And doing that will create this regenerated consciousness. So she's really trying to get him on board. So Nuit here is kind of like a Dakini, if you're familiar with Indian Tantra. So a Dakini is a female tantric initiate whose job it is to bring men up, to initiate men into the mysteries, the deeper mysteries of the ancient world. the deeper mysteries of ecstatic being. For example, a famous case, Saraha, you could look him up. I think in northern India a couple of thousand years ago, could be a little bit off there. But he was like high-born guy who wanted to study religion, didn't really want to be like a high kind of person running stuff, and wanted to get more into religion and the Buddha nature and this kind of thing, and went off to study with a very famous mystical priest, a man, but it felt like he hadn't really, he'd learned all this stuff, but he still hadn't really had a deep mystical experience. And he's kind of hanging around in this marketplace, he's finished with this guy, and he spots this woman making arrows, this very low caste woman who's just sitting on the ground, kind of making arrows. And there's something about this woman that really attracts her to him. And he goes up to her and she kind of berates him a bit and belittles him. But he comes to realize somewhere that she is a Dakini and she's here to teach him. And then he becomes her pupil and they go and live in graveyards and all sorts of tantric things together. And essentially the same relationship is being articulated here. Nuit, though she's being a bit more nice about it, she's saying, you've done a good job, warrior lord of Thebes, the emperor, you've kept this consciousness safe for this period, but now it's time for change. You need to let me in, is what she's saying. You need to let me in. You've got too much control and you're not letting me in. So then she exhorts him, be thou her deet, my secret center, my heart and my tongue. So she's saying, stop being this intellect that's built up around the point of awareness and go back to being a point of awareness. Okay, so that's really the opening 6 lines of Liber Al, which I just really wanted to talk about. I love this work. Some of it I don't understand. Some of it is very shocking. But what's interesting about it is that, Crowley aside, not many people have tried to interpret it. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. If we go down to the end, just before I finish this video. So there's this thing called the comment, which was also written and channeled with the book. And, let's just look at that quickly. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So that's the basic summary statement of Thelema. The study of this book is forbidden. It is wise to destroy this copy after first reading. Well, Crowley, he didn't do that, though he nearly did. Whosoever disregards this does so at his own risk and peril. These are most dire, that typical kind of grimoire warning of bad things that are going to happen. But here's the very interesting line. Those who discuss the contents of this book are to be shunned by all as centers of pestilence. So obviously, if you're thinking of, doing an interpretation of the book of the law, this is going to be a bit of a neg that if you do it, you're going to be shunned by everyone as a center of pestilence. But you need also to look at this in the context of the Aeon changeover and the changes in subjective experience that are taking place during this time. So, if you're basically kind of interpreting this book and you're writing your interpretation and you think you're going to get super self-aggrandizement, everyone's going to think what a great Liber Al scholar this guy is, then all you're doing is you're defaming, you're kind of almost abusing the text and its original purpose for your own. You're maintaining the Piscean era perspective, and in fact you're reinforcing this Piscean era subjective perspective. But if you want to interpret the Liber Al, you also have to be engaged with the transformational process that it is articulating subtly. It's not so much that it's absolutely forbidden to interpret this book. It's just that you have to be careful where you're coming from when you do that you're forwarding the agenda, you're not kind of reversing it. Okay, cool. So that's my presentation about the opening lines of Liber Al. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to sharing some more content with you soon. Thank you.